The airport was as chaotic as it always was. A sea of people shuffled through security, the sound of hurried footsteps echoing in the hallways. Suitcases rolled across the smooth floors with rhythmic clicks, and the overhead announcements boomed through the speakers, barely making an impression on anyone too preoccupied with their phones. Among the sea of rushing passengers, Victoria Grant stood tall, her business suit sharply tailored to fit the powerful CEO she had become. With each step, the weight of her success and responsibilities seemed to follow her. She had built an empire, one that demanded her attention at every turn. But today, as she stood at the airport waiting for her flight, she could feel something was amiss. Edith Grant, her mother, stood quietly beside her, looking lost in the vast crowd. Edith, in her late 60s, was a woman whose eyes had seen the world, but whose voice had never been heard. She was deaf, a condition that had isolated her for much of her life. In her younger years, she had fought for recognition, trying to overcome the challenges that came with her silence. But now, as she stood in the crowded terminal, she had long given up on trying to make others understand her. Despite Victoria's presence, despite the world seeing her as a powerful, respected figure, her mother remained invisible. Victoria, as caught up in her phone call as ever, didn't notice her mother's discomfort. She was used to the quiet resilience of Edith. But today, as she glanced briefly at her mother, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The quiet, almost invisible figure of her mother had become a fixture in her life, a constant, even as she rose to the top of her career. But today, standing at the airport, Victoria felt an unfamiliar pang of guilt in her chest. Edith waved her hands slightly in front of her, trying to get someone's attention. She wasn't asking for help. She was trying to speak, in her own way. But no one seemed to notice her. People passed by without a glance, caught up in their own world. Victoria was too absorbed in her phone call, ignoring the subtle signals that her mother needed attention. This was something Edith had come to accept over the years, the silence, the isolation. Yet it was still painful. As the minutes dragged on, Victoria remained unaware of her mother's plight, lost in her own bubble of work and deadlines. She had seen her mother go through this countless times, but today, something about it felt different. Something was off. But before she could analyze it, a sudden voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, is she all right?" Jason Carter wasn't expecting to find himself involved in anything out of the ordinary that morning. As a single father, his life was a whirlwind of activities revolving around his daughter Ella. Today was no exception. He had just finished a phone call with a client and was now racing to find Ella, who had wandered off during their layover. He had raised her alone after the unexpected death of his wife, and he had become accustomed to balancing work with his responsibilities as a father. He had never been a man who liked drawing attention to himself. His days were usually filled with mundane tasks, meetings, and spending time with his daughter. But as he rushed through the terminal, his eyes briefly caught sight of Edith, the elderly woman standing alone. Something about the sight of her struck him, an odd feeling that tugged at him unexpectedly. He had seen so many people pass by without a second glance, but there was something about Edith that stopped him in his tracks. She was alone, clearly struggling to communicate, her hands waving gently in the air, not in desperation, but in an almost resigned way. She wasn't begging for help, but she was silently trying to make contact with the world around her. The realization hit him hard. Edith wasn't invisible to him. She was visible, and he wasn't going to let her stand there without offering assistance. Jason stepped forward and approached Edith cautiously. The woman was older than him, but there was something graceful in her posture, despite the visible sadness in her eyes. He cleared his throat, unsure of what to say. He wasn't fluent in sign language, but he had learned a few basic phrases over the years, just enough to offer help when necessary. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, his voice kind. "Can I help you with anything?" Edith turned toward him. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with surprise. Jason noticed the slight flicker of hope in her expression, the way her face softened as if she had just realized someone had acknowledged her presence. She raised her hands, using simple gestures. Her movements were fluent and graceful, but Jason knew he couldn't understand everything. Still, he tried to follow her lead. He had learned a little bit of sign language in college, enough to make small talk and express basic things. He hesitated, but then remembered one of the phrases he had learned years ago. "I can help you find someone, if you need." Jason signed slowly, watching her carefully. Edith's expression shifted, and for a brief moment, Jason saw a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. She signed back quickly, the words coming easily, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. "Victoria," she signed, her fingers moving with precision. "I'm looking for my daughter." Jason nodded, understanding enough to recognize the name. He glanced around, scanning the area for anyone who might be Victoria, but there was no sign of her. "I'll help you find her," he promised, giving a reassuring smile. While Jason worked with Edith to communicate, Victoria continued her phone call, unaware of what was happening just a few feet away. She was lost in her own world, her mind still focused on the deal she was negotiating. The contract could make or break her company. She was too absorbed in the task to see that something wasn't right. She knew her mother was deaf, but she had always assumed that, because of her mother's quiet nature, she could handle everything on her own. It wasn't until she hung up the phone and turned to look around that she noticed the absence of Edith. Panic swept over her for a split second as she scanned the room, but then she spotted her mother. What struck her was the sight of a stranger standing next to Edith, gently signing with her. At first, Victoria felt a twinge of annoyance. Who was this person, and why was he talking to her mother? But then, as her eyes locked on the scene, something unexpected happened. Edith's face was no longer the lonely, distant expression it had been moments ago. There was a soft smile on her lips, a glint of recognition in her eyes. She was being seen. The realization hit Victoria hard. In the midst of her own world, she had completely missed how much her mother had been struggling. Her heart sank. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice tinged with guilt as she walked toward Jason and her mother. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." Jason looked at her, his smile warm. "It's no trouble at all," he said. "Your mom's a lovely lady. Just needed someone to pay attention." Victoria looked at her mother, her gaze softening. She had been so absorbed in her work, so consumed by the next big deal, that she hadn't noticed the most important thing of all. Her mother, the one person who had always been there for her, had been invisible in her life for far too long. I should have done more," Victoria whispered to herself, but she said it loud enough for Jason to hear. "You can't change the past," he replied, his tone gentle. "But you can change how you act from here on out." Victoria nodded slowly. "I want to," she said, more determined than ever. "I want to be there for her. I lost sight of what really mattered." The three of them stood together for a while in the bustling airport, a brief moment of quiet in the chaos around them. Victoria couldn't help but feel a weight lift off her shoulders as she stood there with her mother and this stranger who had shown her the most valuable lesson she'd learned in a long time. "Thank you," Victoria said again to Jason, her voice sincere. "I'll make sure to be more present from now on." Jason smiled, his eyes twinkling. "It's all about the little things," he said, glancing at Edith, who was now happily chatting with her daughter, a softness in her eyes. "I'm glad I could help," Jason said before turning to leave, a warm feeling in his chest. As he walked away, he knew that this brief moment had changed not only Victoria and her mother's relationship, but also his own view of life. In a world so consumed by distractions and demands, sometimes all it took was one person to stop, notice, and offer a simple act of kindness. As Victoria and Edith boarded their flight, Victoria couldn't help but feel a sense of calm settle over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt that she was truly seeing her mother not just as a mother, but as a person with her own struggles, her own desires, her own silent battles. She had spent so many years caught up in the noise of her life that she had forgotten the simple truth. It's the quiet moments, the connections we make, that matter the most. For Jason, that moment in the airport was a reminder of the impact small gestures can have on someone's life. A simple sign, a simple act of kindness, had been the catalyst for change. He walked away with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had made a difference, even if just for a moment. And in the end, that was enough. The flight was long, and as the hours passed, Victoria Grant found herself staring out the window, lost in thought. The endless stretches of clouds beneath her were nothing compared to the whirlwind of thoughts inside her head. Edith, her mother, had fallen asleep beside her, her head resting gently on the window, her hands folded in her lap. Despite the comfort of the seat, there was an undeniable tension in the air, one that Victoria hadn't been able to shake since the moment she had realized how much she had ignored her mother. As the flight continued, Victoria reflected on her life. Her career had become her identity. She had been focused on the next big deal, the next milestone, the next achievement. But the truth was, none of those things mattered if the people who mattered most weren't a part of it. Edith had always been there for her, even when Victoria was too caught up in her world to see her. For the first time in years, Victoria felt her resolve break. She wasn't just a CEO. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a daughter who had neglected her mother, and it hurt. But perhaps there was still time to change that. Perhaps with Edith, she could finally begin to rebuild the relationship that had always been there, but had been buried beneath the weight of Victoria's ambition. When they landed, Victoria took Edith's hand as they walked out of the airport. There was a new sense of closeness between them now, something that had been missing for so long. Edith, despite her silent world, had always communicated in subtle ways. The way she smiled at her daughter, the way she held her gaze. These were the gestures Victoria had overlooked in the past. But today, as they walked together through the bustling airport, Victoria finally noticed them. "Mom," she said softly, her voice full of sincerity, "I've been so focused on myself and my career that I've missed so much. I'm sorry." Edith didn't need words to respond. She gave Victoria a soft smile, the kind of smile that told her daughter everything she needed to hear. She reached out and squeezed Victoria's hand in return. It was as if she was saying, "I've been waiting for you to see me. I've always been here." It was a small gesture, but to Victoria, it meant the world. After they returned home, Victoria found herself thinking about Jason Carter more often. It had been a fleeting encounter at the airport, but his kindness and his willingness to take the time to communicate with Edith had left a lasting impression. There was something about him, a quiet confidence, a genuine kindness that made Victoria realize how disconnected she had become from the world around her. She sat in her office, looking over emails and contracts, but her mind kept drifting back to that moment at the airport. Jason had been the catalyst for something larger than just helping her mother. He had reminded her that the most valuable connections were the ones we make with people, not the ones we make with projects or business deals. That evening, Victoria decided to find Jason. She wanted to thank him properly, to tell him how his simple act of kindness had opened her eyes to a side of herself she hadn't known was missing. She found his contact information online and hesitated before sending him a message. It was strange. She had never been the type to reach out to strangers, let alone someone like Jason, but she felt compelled to do so. "Hi, Jason. I just wanted to thank you again for what you did for my mother today. You've truly made an impact on me. I'd like to meet with you sometime to express my gratitude in person." After hitting send, she leaned back in her chair, unsure of what to expect. Would he even respond? Within moments, her phone buzzed. "Hi, Victoria. It's no problem at all. I'm just glad I could help. I'd be happy to meet whenever you're free." Her heart skipped a beat. The next afternoon, Victoria and Jason met at a cafe downtown. As soon as she saw him, she was struck by how different he seemed from the high-powered executives she usually dealt with. He was dressed casually, nothing flashy, but there was a certain warmth in his eyes, a genuine openness that made her feel at ease. "Thanks for meeting me," Victoria said, her voice soft but sincere. "Of course," Jason replied, smiling. "I didn't do anything special. Just helped your mom. She's a lovely lady, and I'm glad I could be there for her." Victoria sat across from him, her hands resting on the table. She felt the weight of everything she wanted to say. She had lived so many years thinking that business and success were all that mattered, but sitting here with Jason, she realized how little that had brought her. "You're right," she said slowly. "It wasn't a big deal to you, but it meant everything to me, to her, to us. I've been so wrapped up in work, in making money, in climbing the ladder, that I didn't see what was right in front of me." Jason leaned back in his chair, listening intently. "Sometimes, we need someone to remind us of what truly matters," he said gently. There was something about his words, simple but wise, that made Victoria realize how disconnected she had become from her true self. She had lost touch with the part of her that cared about human connection, about family, and about making a difference in someone's life beyond the bottom line. As the weeks went by, Victoria made a conscious effort to reconnect with Edith. She no longer rushed through their time together, no longer pushed her aside for work meetings or business trips. Instead, she made the time real time, with her mother. She learned to appreciate the quiet moments, the moments where no words were spoken, where the simple act of being present was enough. She also kept in touch with Jason, and the two of them began to share stories about their lives, their experiences, and their dreams. There was something comforting in their conversations, a sense of understanding and mutual respect. They both understood what it was like to care for someone without expecting anything in return, to give without the desire for recognition. One evening, Victoria invited Jason to dinner at her home. As they sat around the table, Edith joining them, Victoria couldn't help but feel the weight of her earlier mistakes lifting. She had learned something invaluable through this unexpected encounter. Jason had helped her see that the most important things in life were the relationships we nurture, the love we give, and the time we spend with those who truly matter. The autumn air was crisp as Victoria Grant stepped out onto the balcony of her penthouse. She gazed over the city, the skyline stretching out before her like an endless sea of glass and steel. The lights twinkled below, and the hum of the city seemed like a distant echo to her, a noise she had grown used to but no longer appreciated in the same way. It had been several weeks since the dinner with Jason and Edith. And in that time, Victoria had made an effort to rebuild her relationship with her mother. She made it a point to spend time with her, whether it was over lunch, a walk in the park, or simply watching TV together in the evenings. The bond between them had deepened, but there was still a lingering sense of guilt in Victoria's chest. Guilt over the years she had let slip by without truly seeing her mother, without truly appreciating the person who had shaped her into the woman she had become. Yet, despite the progress she had made, Victoria still felt like she was drifting, caught between the pull of her old life and the new direction she was trying to carve for herself. The weight of her responsibilities as CEO was always there, tugging at her like an invisible hand. The world she had built for herself, the late nights, the meetings, the relentless pursuit of success, felt hollow now, as though she were chasing something that had no true meaning. But the feeling wasn't all-consuming. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw Jason's name. A small smile tugged at her lips as she swiped to answer. "Hey, Jason," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "Hey, how's it going?" he replied. His tone, casual, but genuine. "It's going," she chuckled, leaning against the railing. "Just thinking about the next step, I guess." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Victoria wondered if he was about to offer his usual calm reassurance. But instead, Jason's voice grew more serious. "You know, you don't have to figure it all out by yourself, right?" Victoria's breath caught in her chest. She hadn't realized how much she had been carrying until that moment. She had spent so long building walls around her, protecting herself from the vulnerability of admitting that she didn't have all the answers. "I don't know how to let go of all this pressure," she confessed softly, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "Everything's always moving so fast, and I'm just trying to keep up." "I get it," Jason said. "But sometimes, slowing down, being present, really being there for the people who matter, makes all the difference. It's a balance you can find, but it takes time." Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing his words. She had always prided herself on her ability to control her life, to make the hard decisions, to climb higher than anyone thought possible. But now, standing on the precipice of a new chapter, she realized that the true challenge lay in letting go of the fear that had driven her all these years. "You're right," she said finally, a newfound clarity in her voice. "I've been running for so long that I forgot what it was like to actually live. Living isn't about the next deal or the next step up the ladder. Jason replied, his voice steady and kind. "It's about the connections you make, the people you care about, and the moments you share. Don't forget that." There was a long pause, the weight of his words settling over Victoria like a comforting blanket. She leaned back, looking out at the sprawling city below. It felt like the first time in years that she wasn't looking ahead, trying to push herself further, but instead, simply existing in the moment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. I think I needed to hear that. The following days were a whirlwind. Victoria's assistant sent over the usual batch of meetings, contracts, and urgent calls that demanded her attention, but there was something different about the way she approached them now. Victoria didn't feel like she had to push herself to the edge to be successful anymore. She began delegating more, trusting others to handle the parts of the business she had once taken on herself. She still ran the company, of course, but now she was learning how to step back and let the people she trusted take the reins, while she focused more on what mattered to her personally. One evening, after finishing a day of meetings, Victoria decided to visit Edith. She arrived at her mother's modest apartment, and as she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but smile. Over the last few weeks, their relationship had blossomed in ways Victoria hadn't imagined. Edith opened the door with a warm smile and immediately gestured for Victoria to come inside. The apartment was simple, cozy, and full of the quiet comfort of home. "I made tea," Edith signed, her hands moving with grace and ease. Victoria nodded in return, grateful for the time to just be with her mother. They sat down together, sipping tea, sharing stories, and laughing about old memories. It wasn't much, but it was everything to Victoria, the comfort of being present with the person who had given her everything. In that moment, she realized how much she had taken for granted over the years. Just then, her phone buzzed again. Jason was calling. "Excuse me, Mom," Victoria said, holding up a finger. She quickly answered the call, stepping into the other room for some privacy. "Hey!" She greeted him with a smile in her voice. "I was thinking," Jason said, his tone casual. But there was something in his voice that made Victoria stop. "We should do something this weekend. Maybe a hike or something. I think it's time you step away from the office for a bit, don't you?" The offer was simple, yet it made Victoria pause. She had spent so many years thinking she had to be in control of everything, always working, always pushing herself. But now, the idea of taking time for herself, doing something as simple as going for a hike, sounded like the most liberating thing she could do. "I'd like that," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I think I need it." "Good," Jason said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. "It's about time you gave yourself the space to breathe." That weekend, Victoria and Jason met at the foot of a beautiful hiking trail just outside the city. The air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the mountainside. As they walked side by side, Victoria felt something shift inside her. The noise of her corporate world, the pressure to always be on, began to feel like a distant memory. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just trying to keep up. She was enjoying the moment. "Thanks for this," Victoria said, looking over at Jason with a grateful smile. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." "You're welcome," he replied, smiling back. Sometimes, all it takes is a break from the chaos. As they reached the top of the trail, they stopped to admire the view, the sprawling city below, the mountains stretching endlessly ahead. It was beautiful, peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, Victoria felt a deep sense of contentment. She wasn't running anymore. The weekend hike had been exactly what Victoria needed. The fresh air, the wide open spaces, and the physical challenge of the trail had provided her with a much-needed break from the high-octane world she had been living in. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape, Victoria realized something fundamental had shifted in her. Before, she had been driven solely by ambition, by the desire to climb higher, to achieve more, to secure her legacy in a world that seemed to demand constant performance. But now, standing on that mountaintop with Jason, she felt a deep sense of peace that had been absent for so long. It wasn't about the next deal, the next contract, or the next promotion. It was about the present, about being here, about living. As they walked back down the trail, Jason casually mentioned that he had been thinking about his own life, about how he had spent so many years in survival mode, raising Ella alone, putting every ounce of energy into making sure she was happy and healthy. But now, he was beginning to think about himself again, about what he wanted from life. It had taken him a long time to realize that he couldn't pour from an empty cup. Sometimes I think we focus so much on doing for others that we forget to take care of ourselves, Jason said, his voice thoughtful as they made their way down the path. Victoria looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. She hadn't realized until that moment how much of herself she had given to her work, to the company, to expectations from others. In a way, Jason had taught her something she hadn't even realized. She needed to learn how to nurture the person you are before the titles and the responsibilities. "You're right," she said quietly, her thoughts swirling with the weight of what he was saying. "I've been so wrapped up in trying to please others, trying to prove myself, that I forgot how to be kind to myself." Jason gave her a sidelong glance, offering her a comforting smile. "It's a hard lesson to learn, but it's the most important one." Chapter 13. The Gift of Time. The next week, Victoria found herself thinking more and more about her place in the world. Her time with Jason had sparked a desire to change her pace, and as the days went by, she found herself making small yet significant decisions that allowed her to reclaim control of her own life. She began to delegate more at work, trusting her team to handle what she had previously micromanaged. It was difficult at first. Letting go of control was never easy for someone like Victoria. But she knew that in order to truly embrace this new perspective, she had to step back. She found herself spending more time with Edith, going on long walks, enjoying quiet lunches together, and even laughing about old family stories that had long been forgotten. They had missed out on so much time, but now that they were reconnecting, Victoria was determined to make up for it. The evenings were spent differently too. Instead of closing deals late into the night, Victoria started reading books again, taking long baths, and focusing on her own well-being. She even started journaling, something she had once done as a child, but abandoned in the pursuit of success. Writing about her thoughts, her feelings, and her experiences gave her an outlet for everything she had bottled up over the years. But one night, as Victoria sat by the window of her apartment, watching the city lights below, she received an unexpected call. It was from the board of her company. "Victoria," the voice on the other end said, sounding formal but urgent. "We need you back in the game. There's a potential merger on the table, and we believe you're the best person to lead this." Victoria's pulse quickened, the familiar adrenaline rush flooding her veins. She had been so focused on making space for herself, so intent on shifting her priorities, that this call felt like a sudden jolt back into the old rhythm. The old Victoria, the one who thrived on deals and strategy, was pulling her back. She glanced at her phone, the message from the board flashing on the screen, reminding her of the pressure and expectations that would come with this new opportunity. For a moment, she felt the familiar pull, the temptation to dive back into the familiar world of corporate hustle. But then, something inside her hesitated. Jason's words echoed in her mind. It's about balance. It's about knowing when to step back and when to push forward. After the call, Victoria sat silently, contemplating her options. This was the moment of truth. She had spent years building an empire, climbing the corporate ladder, becoming the woman everyone expected her to be. But now, with everything she had learned over the past weeks, could she really go back to the same pace she once set for herself? She thought about her mother, about the time they had spent together and how precious those moments were. She thought about Jason, and the way he had shown her how to be present in her own life again, how to slow down, breathe, and reconnect with herself. There was a knock on her door. Edith stood in the doorway, a soft smile on her face. She had come over to visit, as she often did now, and brought with her a pot of Victoria's favorite tea. "Tea?" Edith signed, gesturing with her hands. Victoria nodded, feeling a deep sense of contentment as she joined her mother at the table. The simple act of sharing a moment like this, without the pressure of work or obligations, filled her with a warmth she hadn't realized she had been missing. As they sat together, sipping tea in silence, Victoria realized something profound. The real value in her life was not in the constant pursuit of success. It was in the people she loved, the moments she cherished, and the peace she had found in slowing down. She took a deep breath, her mind made up. She wasn't going to return to the boardroom just yet. She wasn't ready to give up the peace she had finally found. Instead, she would create a new path, a path that allowed her to live in balance, to succeed without sacrificing the things that truly mattered. A few weeks later, Victoria made the decision. She declined the merger opportunity, choosing instead to focus on her personal growth and her relationship with Edith. She took a temporary leave from the company, delegating her responsibilities to trusted executives and allowing herself the time to breathe, to live. During this time, she became more involved in community initiatives, focusing on causes close to her heart. She used her platform to bring attention to social issues, particularly those related to the deaf community, and began working with nonprofit organizations to support their missions. Edith was thrilled to be a part of these efforts, and Victoria discovered a new sense of purpose in using her success for the greater good. And all the while, Jason remained a steady presence in her life. Their friendship grew deeper, their conversations richer. As they shared their hopes and fears, they both realized that life was about the connections we made along the way. Not the accolades, the money, or the status. It was the people who mattered, and the love we gave them. Years later, as Victoria sat beside her mother in their favorite park, watching the sunset, she reflected on how far she had come. She had built a life that was grounded in balance, in love, and in the recognition that true success came from the relationships we foster, the compassion we show, and the time we spend being present with the ones we care about. The world had tried to pull her in a million directions, but Victoria had finally found her own path. A path where she could thrive, not just as a CEO, but as a daughter, a friend, and a woman who had learned how to truly live. And in that moment, she knew. This was the life she had always wanted.